The Sega Master System is an often overlooked retro console, unlike the Sega Genesis which came after it, which is one of the most treasured. It was demolished in the markets even though it had better graphics than the far more popular NES, and because of that it had great arcade ports that were popular at the time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just check out where the Master System started. The Sega Master System actually started as the Sega Mark III in Japan on October 20th, 1985, as a follow-up to the Sega Game 1000 and 1002, usually abbreviated as SG-1000 or SG-1002. It was a very different looking system than the Master System, though about the same size. For release in the US and UK, it was redesigned to the familiar red and black Master System power base you are probably more familiar with. The Mark III had a cartridge slot, a card slot, and 2 controller ports. The pause button was built onto the system and not the controllers. The cartridges looked more like Atari cartridges than the square Master System versions. The original Mark III only lasted about 2 years on the market, and the redesigned version made for other markets replaced it in the Japanese market. The Mark III and then Sega Master System was a major failure in Japan. Even though it's considered a failure in the US, its lifespan was much shorter in Japan, with the last licensed game coming out in 1989. Only 4 years on the market, it simply could not compete with the Famicom and PC Engine. There were of course accessories for the Master System, and though it wasn't a successful system, it actually had a decent selection. The controllers for both had 2 buttons, a large D-pad, and no start or select functions. Earlier models had the cord coming out of the side, much like the Famicom controllers, and had the ability to screw in a joystick to the D-pad. Other controllers were of course released, which notoriously had the buttons on the left-hand side. There were the arcade joysticks, which had huge square tops on them. There was also a trackball controller called the Sega Sports Pad. While interesting and maybe useful from time to time, the backwards buttons on both and the overly large joystick on a small base hindered most usefulness for many. The light gun, called the phaser, was based on the gun in the anime Zillion. Hilariously enough, you did not use the phaser in the 2 Zillion games, which were also released for the Master System. The most impressive accessory, of course, is the 3D glasses. Most attempts at 3D up to this point used those awesome red and blue glasses to get the effect, which wasn't the best. Try playing Nintendo's Rad Racer in the sweet 3D mode. I can see why this wasn't pursued for very long. But Sega's glasses were actually electronic and plugged into the system by way of the card slot. They used stereoscopic shutter technology to flash between images in your right and left eye. Only 8 games were made for use with the glasses, Space Harrier 3D, Zaxxon 3D, and Outrun 3D being the most popular. Of course, the system is only as good as its games, and though the Sega Master System's library is limited, especially in the third-party area, it isn't crippled. Sega did a pretty good job releasing original games and ports of its classic arcade games. These ports were usually pretty nice, since the Master System had more powerful capabilities. As I previously mentioned, the Master System had ports for cartridges and cards. There's nothing really special about the cartridges. I'm sure you've seen them with their hard cases, usually peculiar artwork on a grid background, and the plain black cartridges with a very thin label. The Sega cards, on the other hand, came in this thinner hard case. The cards themselves fit the name very well. They aren't much bigger or thicker than a credit card. The cards were for people who wanted a game on a budget, and the games reflected that, though they actually still fared a little better than many NES games at the time. They were simpler games in style as well, such as Teddy Boy, which is a very classic style arcade game where you run around on a repeating screen shooting a large amount of enemies, or Transbot, which was a shooter. Transbot actually had a decent depth to the gameplay, allowing you to switch between several different ships, or robot transformations, that changes your strategy. One of the more popular Sega card games would be Ghost House, another simple arcade platformer. The full cartridge games, for the most part, used the Master System to their full advantage, and there were some great arcade ports and original games. Though not the best system on the market graphics-wise, it certainly had some nice ones for an 8-bit system. The system allowed for very vivid colors and larger, more detailed sprites. Great examples are comparing the NES and SMS versions of Ghostbusters and Rampage. Both SMS games are just way more detailed. There were a lot of classic Sega arcade ports for games like Shinobi, Alien Syndrome, and Space Harrier. You also had RPGs, action RPGs, platformers, shooters, and more. Games like Ovelius or Aztec Adventure, and of course you had the Alex Kidd series for your platforming fix, and Wonder Boy, which provided another platforming game, and the titles that followed were well-made action RPGs. The Master System even got a port of King's Quest, which is rather fun to play. But the Master System just couldn't survive. It was overshadowed, had little third-party support, and that kept the library small. It survived long enough to get a system redesign, but it failed soon after. But it did do better in other countries. The second system was your classic shrunk-down version. Sega removed the card slot probably since the card games weren't very popular and few were released on regular carts anyway. But no card slot meant no 3D glasses support. This redesign was an attempt to rekindle interest in the Sega Master System now that the Sega Genesis was released. Sega also released a power-based converter which allowed Master System games on the Genesis and Mega Drive. This redesign didn't really do much for the North American market, and the Master System vanished in 1992, pulling the plug only after 2 years. But in the UK and Brazil, it went on for a lot longer. In many areas of the UK, the Master System lasted until the Mega Drive saw its end in 1996. But in Brazil, the system's actually still going strong. Several redesigns over the years, new games, and now they are still releasing systems with a huge library of built-in games. So that's a brief overview of the Master System. It's far too overlooked in my opinion for some of the very fun and unique games you can get on the system. If you're a fan of RPGs and action RPGs, you really need to get one just to experience games like Phantasy Star and the Wonder Boy series. Prices for the hardware and the games have only gone up since it's getting harder to find working systems and games that aren't Outrun and Great Baseball. But if you work at it, you should find yourself a nice lot for a good price, and it will be worth it. I'll see you next time.